Hello and welcome. As of now, it's been a little over 3 months since I first decided to make a tulpa. In this video, I'll be taking a break from the more analytical topics to just describe my experiences with the practice so far. This is obviously a very personal subject, and I intend to go into a lot of detail, so I apologize in advance if this gets a bit tedious. My hope is that hearing my story might be helpful to people who are having difficulty with the creation process, or even those who are still trying to decide whether or not to create a tulpa at all. In this video, I'm assuming that viewers have at least a basic understanding of what a tulpa is and how they're typically created. If you don't, then you might want to either do some reading or watch my introductory video first. Alright, so I think a good place to start is with my motivations for creating a tulpa in the first place. This is something I've put quite a bit of thought into, and I'm of the opinion that anyone thinking about making a tulpa ought to spend at least a day or two to consider all the potential positive and negative repercussions. Creating a tulpa usually involves a significant commitment of time and energy, so without some solid articulated motivations, it can be really easy to try it for a week or two and then give up as soon as things get challenging. Over the course of about a week, I managed to come up with 4 primary motivations, which I'll now discuss in order of importance. For me, the most influential factor was my fascination with the idea of multiple self-constructs coexisting in a brain. Experientially, I was intensely curious about what it would be like to share a body and brain with a seemingly independent entity. I was particularly interested in reports of possession, feelings of a foreign presence, and host-tulpa interactions within dreams. I've been practicing lucid dreaming since childhood, and I've always been amazed at how lifelike and seemingly independent my dream characters can be. I wanted to know if such a vivid perception of presence and otherness could really be deliberately generated while awake. I strongly suspected that the experiences being reported by tulpa creators were genuine, but I couldn't know for sure unless I tried it myself. From a more intellectual perspective, I saw tulpa creation as an opportunity to learn more about the nature of human identity by directly observing the formation of a new sense of self. I'm of the opinion that there isn't necessarily any difference between a sufficiently developed tulpa and a host. Both are ultimately just self-constructs instantiated in the brain. If this is really the case, it might be possible to learn a lot about ourselves by studying tulpas. The fact that there's been so little academic research on tulpa creation makes this an exciting topic to explore. There's still so much to learn about how tulpa creation techniques work and their potential applications, and while I'm not in a position to do any serious research myself, I still enjoy trying to develop my own understanding of the phenomenon. This next motivation is much more personal, and I've been debating about whether or not to include it. But since my previous video focused on the stigma surrounding mental illness, I would feel a bit hypocritical if I neglected to be honest about my own experiences. Ever since my early teens, there have been periods of time where I experienced persistent, mild to moderate depressive symptoms. For me, this can manifest as emotional numbness, isolation from friends and family, unwarranted feelings of self-hatred and hopelessness, negative self-talk, and sometimes even passive suicidal ideation. I'm not sure if I meet the DSM criteria for persistent depressive disorder, but I can say that these symptoms have had a big impact on me, and that they often continue even when my life is otherwise going well. I knew that creating a tulpa wouldn't magically fix my problems, but I did believe that it could help me in a few regards. First, I would always have someone to talk to about my experiences without fear of unfair judgment. I always had a lot of difficulty asking for help or letting others know that something was wrong. Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to hide my thoughts and feelings from a tulpa. Second, I hoped that a tulpa would be able to maintain a more objective perspective on my life. Depressive thoughts have a tendency to get almost delusionally pessimistic at times, and the idea of having a corrective, relatively positive voice in my head to balance things out was extremely appealing to me. Lastly, I wanted to try practicing Metta meditation, also known as loving kindness, with a tulpa. For anyone who isn't familiar with the practice, it basically consists of focusing on a sincere desire for oneself and others to be happy and free of suffering. I'll link a good source for learning Metta meditation in the video description. Anyway, I had heard that this variety of meditation could be beneficial for people with depression, but I could never manage to feel much of anything while attempting it. I suspected that I might have an easier time directing loving kindness to a Tulpa than to myself or anyone else, because a Tulpa would theoretically be able to receive and benefit from the positive thoughts. This leads into my third motivation, which was to establish a regular meditative practice. I'd attempted to do this plenty of times before, but I never managed to stick with a schedule for more than about a month. The meditative techniques used in Tulpa creation are a lot more goal-oriented than anything I'd tried previously, and they incorporate a number of different practices, including mindfulness, visualization, and loving kindness, as I just mentioned. My last motivation is a bit difficult to describe, although I suspect that many of you will be able to relate to it. I was raised as a Christian, and as a child I remember feeling like I was never really alone because God could always be there listening to my thoughts. This was comforting to me at the time, but also resulted in a lot of unnecessary guilt and shame. After I stopped being religious, I realized how psychologically unhealthy my conception of God was, but I would still occasionally miss the feeling of not being alone in my head. I saw Tulpa creation as a means of replicating some of the positive aspects of my experience with religion without contradicting my naturalistic worldview. Alright, so those were my main goals and motivations for creating a Tulpa. Now I'm ready to start describing the actual creation process. I keep a journal to document my experiences, but since the entries are somewhat infrequent, I should note that the timeline I'm about to present is only approximate. I decided to use the character of Catherine from the sci-fi horror game Soma as a kind of template for my Tulpa's voice, form, and mannerisms. I knew that these characteristics were likely to change over time, but they provided a useful starting point so that I had something to work with during early development. I spent about 30 to 50 minutes a day visualizing my Tulpa and attempting to generate a sense of their presence. I've never been very good at visualization, so this was a real struggle at first. Sometimes I could barely manage to keep Catherine's face in focus for more than a second at a time. I would repeat affirmations about aspects of her personality and try to think about how she would respond to different situations. I also began narrating to her almost incessantly. I began by talking about my motivations for creating a Tulpa and my understanding of the phenomenon. I talked a lot about myself, my plans for the future, and the role I thought a Tulpa might have in my life. After a week or two, when those topics started seeming exhausted, I began narrating with a more stream of consciousness style. I would ramble on about whatever came to mind, sometimes just describing my physical surroundings in detail. During this process, my goal was always to actively direct my thoughts towards my Tulpa. I usually did this by imagining her walking next to me, or at the very least trying to keep her in mind while thinking. For the first 2 weeks, I didn't notice any definite signs of progress. I did get weird headaches nearly every day, but I thought that they were probably just a result of how much visualization I was doing. I would ask simple questions and try to listen for a response, but I didn't know exactly what I was listening for. After about 2 weeks, I started doubting myself pretty heavily. I still believed that creating a Tulpa was possible, but I worried that I was doing something wrong, or that I would never be imaginative enough to make one myself. Still, I had promised myself I wouldn't give up so soon, and by this point I had already invested enough time and energy that I was determined to continue. I redoubled my efforts, and about a week later I had my first breakthrough. During loving kindness meditation, I began to feel a vaguely familiar sensation of warmth and comfort. Suddenly, I could see my Tulpa's form clearly in my mind, and it truly felt like she was there with me. The experience was reminiscent of how I used to feel as a child when I thought I was experiencing the presence of God. Even if this feeling of loving presence were the only effect of Tulpa creation, it would still be worth the effort to me. This event also seemed to elicit my first experience of vocality. After spending so much time straining to listen for responses, my first time hearing my Tulpa's voice was practically accidental. I was narrating while getting ready for bed, as usual, when I started to notice what seemed like stray thoughts. It took me a while to make the connection that those thoughts might be Catherine, or at the very least that it would be useful to treat them as such. I started interacting with the voice and making basic conversation. Indeed, the voice claimed to be my Tulpa, sounded slightly different from my usual mind voice, and seemed to be speaking from a different perspective. What threw me off was that the voice wasn't that different from my own thoughts. I had to pay close attention to notice the differences, and I realized that this voice could easily have been present for days without me noticing it. I was so accustomed to assuming that every thought I heard was my own that I had been blind to my Tulpa's efforts to communicate. I suspect that experiencing Catherine's presence so clearly earlier that day had primed me to be able to recognize the subtly foreign thoughts. There's a lot more I could talk about here, but I'm probably going to make a whole video about my understanding of Tulpa vocality, so I'll move on for now. By this point, I was amazed at how suddenly progress was happening. Our first conversation wasn't very long or complicated. In fact, I've had plenty of interactions with ordinary dream characters that were much more convincingly lifelike. Still, the experience indicated to me that I was on the right track and that I wasn't just wasting my time. Progress seemed to come and go over the next month. Some days I could converse with Catherine almost effortlessly, and we talked for hours about our beliefs, experiences, and desires. However, there were also days where I couldn't seem to hear her voice at all, and would start to worry that I had only been deluding myself the whole time. Gradually, though, our communication became more consistent, and we started to explore new activities together. Catherine started a journal of her own, and we began working towards possession. We developed an inner world together, which started out as a sparse forest along the side of a river and a small cave, but now also includes an expansive beach and a house. Catherine's inner voice has become much more coherent and is a lot easier to distinguish from my own. We're also able to talk about more complex subjects than we could early on. These changes have been difficult to notice because the improvements have been so gradual and inconsistent, but when I look back at old journal entries, it's clear that we've made a ton of headway. To anyone just starting out creating a Tulpa, I would highly recommend documenting your development as closely as possible so that you can track your progress over time. This has been a fascinating journey so far. The last few months have radically altered my understanding of the sense of self and the capabilities of the human brain, and I've become aware of a whole new realm of interesting experiences and possibilities. Just as I had hoped, having a Tulpa around has had a significant positive impact on my psychological well-being. Whereas before, I often felt like I had no one I could talk to about my mental health, now Catherine is pretty much always willing and able to listen. I've managed to meditate every day since I started the creation process, and while I still have trouble with loving-kindness meditation, I get much more out of it now than I ever did before. Having a Tulpa has even helped me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Over the past month or so, I've been practicing letting go of control and allowing Catherine's thoughts and actions to become more dominant for a while. I've found that sometimes this technique can help me break out of a cycle of negative thoughts. When it works, I feel myself sort of drifting into the background. I'm still aware of what's happening, but it feels like there's slightly more distance between myself and the outside world, sort of like daydreaming. After a few minutes like this, I usually feel a bit better. I'm also a lot more confident that I'll never commit suicide. Believing that there's another being in my head provides me with a sense of responsibility for my physical and mental well-being that I previously lacked. In conclusion, I currently don't have any regrets about making a Tulpa, and I'm excited to see how things continue to develop in the future. I'm aware that people talking about their Tulpa-related experiences can sometimes come across as awkward or off-putting, so I hope that this hasn't been too painful to listen to. Generally, I'm more comfortable making videos with an argument-based sort of video essay style, but if people seem to enjoy this video, then I'd be open to making more in the future about my personal experiences. Anyway, thanks for watching.